Hormuz choke point, the energy dependency of Taiwan and South Korea, plus the materials choke points due to the Hormuz closure. So it's not a theoretical exercise anymore. We have hard data, we have prices, and we have inventory clocks ticking. Today we'll cover helium, the irreplaceable coolant, bromine, the invisible crisis, Taiwan's energy cliff edge, South Korea's material exposure, the EWY paradox, and why the thesis stands. Okay, we've got a two-axis vulnerability, energy dependency and materials dependency. These are not the same problem. They are compounding problems. Taiwan and South Korea together produce approximately 40% of the world's chips. TSMC dominates logic. Samsung and SK Hynix dominate memory. Taiwan's 40% coal dependency is the energy Achilles heel. Coal is usually imported from Australia and Indonesia. It is less Hormuz sensitive than LNG, but Taiwan's LNG imports are very Hormuz sensitive, and those LNG plants are what powers the grid when coal isn't enough. South Korea's 22% nuclear buffer is real, but it does not protect against the bromine and helium dependencies, which are materials problems, not energies problems. The triggering event timeline. So we can establish a factual record because it's no longer a war game scenario. These are documented sequence of events. The conflict began late February 2026 with Operation Epic Fury. US and Israeli airstrikes that killed Supreme Leader Khamenei. Israel's response was to close the Strait of Hormuz to Western commercial shipping. On the March 2nd, Iranian drones and missiles struck Ras Laffan Industrial City, the world's largest LNG complex, and co-located helium extraction facilities. 2 days later, 4th March, Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all LNG-related output, meaning contracts were voided. That single event removed 30 to 33% of global helium supply from the market simultaneously. Spot prices, which were around $300 per 1,000 cubic feet before hostilities, surged to $600 to $900. Some projection have them reaching $2,000 if the disruption is prolonged. It's prolonging. Approximately 200 specialized cryogenic containers are currently stranded in and around the strait. Here is the critical point. Helium boil-off from stranded containers represents permanent loss. Helium is a non-renewable resource. You can't print it. Helium choke point. Why is helium irreplaceable? Because nothing else has its physical properties. It is the coldest liquid on Earth. It has extreme thermal conductivity. It is chemically inert. Its boiling point is the lowest of any element. In a semiconductor fab, helium does three critical jobs. It cools the EUV lithography machines, each of which cost over $350 million and cannot tolerate temperature instability. It detects microscopic leaks in the clean rooms, where a single contamination event destroys an entire wafer run. And it flushes toxic residue from silicon wafers after the etching process. The semiconductor industry consumes approximately 24% of all global helium. It is the world's largest single consumer. And IDTechX forecasts demand to increase more than fivefold over the next decade as chip complexity increases. The 30 to 33% supply removal is equivalent to roughly 5.2 million cubic meters per month gone from the market. The stranded cryogenic containers are not a temporary inventory issue. The helium that boils off is gone forever. For fabs in Taiwan and South Korea, this is not an abstract concern. Rationing of helium has already begun. TSMC analysts are projecting priority adjustments, meaning they will divert available helium toward higher margin AI chip production and away from computer electronics. Apple and Nvidia product timelines are at risk. Alternative sources: Saskatchewan in Montana exist but lack production capacity to close a 30% global gap on any commercially meaningful timeline. This is not a cyclical shock, it is a structural supply event. Bromine choke point. Bromine is the crisis that almost nobody in mainstream financial media is talking about. Fryer has been for some time now, and it may be more dangerous than the helium story. Why is that? Here's the mechanism. Bromine, a raw mineral, is processed into semiconductor-grade hydrogen bromide gas. It is etched chemical that Korean fabs use to carve the transistor structures in every single DRAM and NAND flash chip on Earth. Dynamic RAM powers active computation. NAND flash is the storage in every laptop, phone and data center. Both require bromide gas. ICL Group in Israel controls between 33 and 40% of global bromine production. Its extraction and conversion complex sit together in the Negev Desert near the Dead Sea. Jordan Bromine controls a further 14%. Together, Israel and Jordan represent roughly half of global bromine supply. South Korea sources 97.5% of its bromine imports from Israel. Samsung and SK Hynix are both directly exposed. Bromine spot price had surged to $12,000 per metric ton. Now here is the critical geography point. Israel routes its trade through Mediterranean points, Haifa and Ashdod, bypassing the Strait of Hormuz entirely, so the Hormuz closure itself does not directly threaten Israeli bromine exports. But, and this is the C variable, Iran has been striking the Negev Desert with ballistic missiles. Dimona and Arad are both within 35 kilometers of ICL's Dead Sea complex, and they've been hit. The ICL complex is now within the active missile threat envelope. There is no conversion facilities outside Israel capable of producing semiconductor-grade HBr at the required state, the bromine gas. War on the Rocks, April 2026, said the vulnerability sits in plain sight, within missile range and outside of any meaningful policy response. Taiwan vulnerability. Taiwan's situation has three compounding layers. First, the immediate crisis. Not a single LNG carrier from Qatar has arrived at Taiwan's Yongan terminal at Kaohsiung since the strait closed in March. Taiwan currently holds only 11 days of LNG reserves. The government has promised the semiconductor sector priority access. But critics note this is insufficient if the conflict escalates. Second, the structural energy vulnerability. Taiwan imports 90% of its energy. The nuclear phase-out means there's no base load buffer. 40% of power comes from coal, which is less Hormuz sensitive, but creates its own supply chain risks. When LNG supply tightens, the grid becomes unstable, and grid instability is existential threat to EUV lithography machines, worth 300 million apiece. Bloomberg economics analyst Michael Deng has projected that if helium shortages intensify, TSMC is highly likely to implement priority adjustments, delaying production of general consumer electronics in favour of the higher margin AI accelerator chips. Third, the geopolitical overlay. Bloomberg economics chief geopolitical analyst Jennifer Welch has noted that if China blockades the straits around Taiwan, it would cut off not only energy but semiconductor raw material supplies and finished chip exports simultaneously. TSMC's accelerated Arizona build is a direct response to the risk. Taiwan government's plans to raise the mandatory minimum LNG reserve from 11 days to 14 days starting next year. That timeline is cold comfort given the current situation. South Korea presents the most concentrated vulnerability in the entire thesis. It is simultaneously the world's dominant memory chip producer and the country most materially exposed to disruption of those production inputs. The dependency map is stark. 64% of South Korea's helium comes from Qatar, the very supply that has been cut. 97.5% of its bromine comes from Israel, the very supply that is within missile range. 70% of its crude oil comes from the Middle East. It is the world's third largest LNG importer. The 22% nuclear buffer is real and meaningful for energy stability. It gives Korea more grid resilience than Taiwan. But nuclear power does not help if your bromine supply or helium supply is disrupted. Those are materials problems, not energy problems. Now the paradox, and this is what makes the EWY ETF so complex as a trade. Samsung and SK Hynix are posting extraordinary financial results precisely because memory is so scarce. SK Hynix first quarter 2026 operating margin was 72%, surpassing NVIDIA's 65%. Revenue was up 198 year on year, operating profit up 405%. Goldman has revised its 2026 DRAM supply-demand gap to 4.9%, calling it the most acute shortage in 15 years. The SK Group chairman has publicly stated the shortage is likely to persist until 2030. Gartner estimates combined DRAM and SSD prices could be 130% higher by the end of 2026 versus the end of 2025. The market is currently pricing the demand bonanza. The thesis resolves bearishly when the material disruption overrides pricing power. Until then, do nothing. We wait. The cascade, SOXX, EWY, EWJ. This slide maps the full cascade from the physical event at Ras Laffan to the financial impact on our three bear positions. SOXX, we're awaiting entry. The Semiconductor ETF is the broadest expression of this thesis. EUV cooling is constrained by helium rationing. 3 nanometer and 2 nanometer yield is under pressure. Fab throughout has been reduced as a precaution against power instability. Cost inflation is running 40 to 100% across critical inputs. This affects TSMC, Samsung, Intel, the entire ecosystem. EWY, South Korea ETF, is the most concentrated expression. Samsung and SK Hynix are both directly exposed on helium and bromine simultaneously. The profit paradox is real but finite. The longer the disruption, the more the materials constraint bites into the margin expansion that currently looks so attractive, like a beautiful day at the beach. EWJ, Japan ETF, is the downstream play. We've already got our position, January 2028. Japan sources 95% or more of its crude from the Middle East. Renesas, Toshiba and Kyoxie all have helium exposure through their semiconductor operations. The LNG import cost surge creates stagflation dynamics. Higher costs, weaker yen, compressed margins. Japan has essentially no domestic energy buffer, and add into that their bond market is in disarray. The Moody's quote on the screen captures the thesis elegantly. The AI economy runs on tokens. Tokens run on GPUs, and GPUs depend on Qatari helium, Israeli bromine, and LNG tankers with a single 21-mile wide exit from the Persian Gulf. Boom, boom. The EWY paradox. Tepper, one of the sharpest macro minds on the planet, put $182 million into EWY in first quarter 2026. He is on the opposite side of our trade. He is betting on Samsung and SK Hynix profiting from the memory shortage supercycle. He is not wrong about the current moment. The profit numbers are extraordinary. SK Hynix 72% operating margins beats Nvidia. DRAM contract prices are up 90 to 95% quarter on quarter. The entire HBM supply chain is sold out through 2026 and into 2027. But here's my structural argument. The very products creating those margins, HBM, DRAM, NAD, require more helium and more bromine per wafer as they become more advanced. You cannot expand memory capacity while simultaneously losing access to the etch chemistry and the coolant that makes the capacity possible. The bear thesis is correct on vulnerability. It's the timing. It's always the timing with geopolitical trades. Tepper is pricing the demand side. Fryer is pricing the supply side constraint. Those two views are not permanently compatible. One of them has to give. In Fryer's doctrine terms, we're waiting for the algorithm to confirm. I've added to the algorithm and I've built in the bear indicators. When it was first built and improved upon, it was mainly for bull markets, but I've managed to add another indicator which is for identifying when these tickers are ready to go bull, to go short. Okay, this is the Fryer's thesis validation table. Again, I'll let you, if you want to put it on pause and have a good look. All I want to say here is you cannot conjure semiconductor grade helium from a damaged LNG complex on any timeline shorter than several years. That is the thesis in a sentence. Okay, the key takeaways. Hormuz is not hypothetical. The cascade is live, 30 to 33% of global helium offline since the 4th of March 2026. Bromine is the C variable markets are missing. 97.5% of Korea's supply from Israel within missile range of Iran, and there's no substitute at required scale to replace. Taiwan holds 11 days of LNG reserve, 40% coal dependency. EWY machines worth $350 million are at risk from power instability. I believe Taiwan has teed up LNG supply from Australia until the end of August. I've just found that out. The EWY paradox is real. Samsung and SK Hynix margins are at record highs, but they are very demand driving. Those margins requires more of the endangered materials. The bear thesis on SOXX, EWY, EWJ is structurally validated. Timing is the remaining question. Do nothing until sequencing resolves and we get the signal. We wait. And of course, finally, you can print money, but you cannot conjure semiconductor grade helium from a damaged LNG complex on any timeline shorter than several years. Think about that. Happy days.